We always say seat time is king, so sit on down and listen in to Motorsports Tech Talk with your hosts, Brian and Eric. Eric, how's it going?
Pretty, I don't know. Had some racing earlier today. Someone scratched my car though. I don't know. How are you doing today?
Oh, it's doing pretty good. The season is very fast approaching, so
Yes.
I kind of I felt like I feel like I'm in a better position on at least on the Miata than previous years. I mean, it's definitely better than last year. Last year, at this point in time, I wouldn't have probably even had my transmission replaced or even one rebuilt and ready for it. So I just picked up last weekend. I picked up those rebuilt transmissions, so they're ready to go in, and
Nice.
um, yeah, and then just a couple odds and ends to do on the car. But the transmission's the major thing. I'm hoping to, like I said before, get the new rear diff in there. But that's if it doesn't happen, there's nothing wrong with the current one. Just I'll be slower.
Sure.
So
Well, cool. Sounds like you're getting ready.
yeah, it's I'm looking forward to it. It's always the winter can be tough when it's dark always, and then also you're not racing. So
Right.
uh, yeah, looking forward to getting back out there. So yeah, it'll be end of March so there's still some time, but that can easily just disappear very quickly if you're not careful.
Yeah, I can. Definitely.
Yeah.
So be careful. Is the takeaway from that? No.
But yeah, so today though, we decided we wanted to talk about something we haven't talked about yet, and that's brakes.
Yeah, there's a good opportunity there to I guess spread out some understanding of how the whole system works. Because it's, I guess, maybe not complicated, but there's quite a few different parts of it. And then that's also something that people target when they're building a track car or a race car, right? Is big brake kits. How do I get bigger
Mm-hmm.
brakes on my car? So I guess if we,
Yeah, and you can end up spending a lot of money on that kind of stuff if you're not careful, or maybe if you like to do that, I guess.
yeah, right. So maybe with a better understanding of how it works, people who are on the edge of not having to buy it will realize they don't have to buy it and spend a few grand. So cool.
Yeah,
Yeah, I guess you want to just dive right into it.
yeah, I think. Yeah, I think. Well, for one thing I think I've noticed is at least with kind of amateur endurance racing type stuff is I feel like brake issues are the most common I see outside of just general maybe reliability issues with a specific car. But as far as racing, trying to figure out like new guys coming in, figuring out like what they need to do to their brakes to make them last, make them work, and have good performance out of them. So, but yeah, we'll just start right off at the basics, kind of the full system.
Yeah, yeah. So I guess working from like at the driver interface out. Um, you have a pedal, which goes to your master cylinder, which goes to your brake lines, and potentially a proportioning valve, which then goes out to your calipers, which squeeze on your pads onto the rotor, which is attached to the hub, and that's what slows everything down. So I guess starting at the top, um, the the pedal, the driver interface, will have a ratio, right? It's called a pedal ratio, and effectively what it is the distance from the pivot point to where the pedal actuates the master cylinder, and the distance from the pivot point to where the driver's foot is being applied, right? Same concept as, using a wrench, right?
Mm-hmm.
or any sort of mechanical leverage. That's what you're getting out of that. So your pedal ratio gives you some leverage, and yeah, that's it for the pedal. I guess it's worth noting
Mm-hmm.
for really high-end stuff, not any sort of detail people have to worry about here, but the pedal does follow an arc. So the ratio going into the master cylinder, because that's linear and ideally perpendicular, but again, pedal follows an arc, so not always. That'll change a little bit, but for our purposes, it's just a number, just a regular ratio,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah. For the most part, especially in kind of streetcar, at least modified streetcar stuff, where you're using the stock hardware, there's not really too much opportunity to modify that. The main reason you'd want to is potentially maybe you could lengthen that to give yourself a little less pedal effort. Of course, that might increase your travel, at least the effective travel at your foot. But yeah, for the most part, I mean, it's just one. It's just one characteristic that maybe makes some cars feel a little different than others as far as their brake effort or something.
Right. Yeah, it's one more tuning tool in this big thing. So, um, and everything's a tool in the brake system. So, you go from the pedal to the master cylinder, right? And that's pushing on a cylinder. Go figure. Which is pushing against your brake fluid, which is an incompressible fluid, and the fluid goes all the way down to the caliper, but this piston is pushing against the fluid directly because of the pedal. And the force, well, there's going to be a force at the pedal. I guess the easiest way to think about it is pressure you're building, right? And how it'll relate to stopping effort. So looking at two systems that are the same otherwise, a larger diameter master cylinder will give you you'll need more force, but you'll have less travel, right?
Mm-hmm.
To build the same pressure, you have more area, you need more force, but you'll have less travel.
Yeah, which can be it can be very important to keep an eye out on if you are upgrading your brake calipers, because a lot of times kits that are specifically designed for maybe your specific car, they'll size those pistons to be basically the same area as the stock pistons, or piston, depending on the stock setup. So one thing to look out for is if there is a big brake hit and they are changing that piston size, then potentially you'll want, so basically if the piston area is a lot larger on your new brake setup than the stock one, and you keep your master cylinder alone, there's a chance that you could basically bottom out your master cylinder if you don't have enough travel in that setup to be able to actuate the brakes properly. So it's one thing, like when if you are looking at potentially changing your brake calipers and going to either more or bigger pistons, it's one thing to look out for, that you might want to also size up your master cylinder at the same time to make sure you kind of maintain that same amount of travel that you'd expect. Potentially with that, basically going to bigger pistons on the caliper and a bigger bore, you will increase your pedal effort, but if you still have a brake booster, it probably won't be too noticeable.
Sure. Yeah. I guess, and just to touch on the booster, that's effectively just a giant diaphragm that generally has vacuum on both sides. You press the pedal and you move a little valve, and then you have atmospheric pressure on one side, which then that diaphragm, that difference in pressure, is exerting a force, and it's just assisting your pedal effort. So, but going from the master cylinder, and you have your brake lines, which will go out to the calipers. The way the master cylinder is split up is different through some different cars, so I'm not going to like get too into that, but um, I guess it's worth noting that depending on how it works out, you might have a proportioning valve on the hard line or your brake line that goes to the rear. And the point of that is just to limit, um, your pressure going to the rear, and that way you can maintain a front bias or a specific front bias. So, but those are the lines, right? Eventually you get out to the wheel end, so you'll have your soft line, because your hose needs to be able to move, and that attaches to the caliper. And as Brian already mentioned, the calipers will have a piston or pistons. Some of them have multiple. If you're in a Miata, you have one. So, because it's tiny, or it's a tiny car, but you have a piston, and this is working in the same manner that the piston in the master cylinder works, right? You've built a pressure in the line by using the brake pedal, and this pressure over the area of this piston in the caliper is exerting a force onto the pad, right? And then your pads squeeze your rotor.
Yeah, and one thing to note with brake calipers is there's kind of two major styles that you'll see. Most kind of normal everyday cars, I mean, they're not crazy sports cars or supercars, they'll have kind of a sliding caliper arrangement. So there's only a piston on one side, but then basically entire assembly can kind of slide. It's pushing on one side, and then it can slide on the other. So it's effectively kind of doubling your clamping, versus a kind of monoblock style caliper that you'll see on race cars, your fancy Brembos and stuff, that it's solidly mounted, the whole caliper solidly mounted, and then you have the pistons clamping from both sides. You have two sets of pistons, one on both sides clamping, and then from what I've seen, the main advantage of your monoblocks is that a lot of times they'll be lighter, but that's mostly due to the materials, because the monoblocks will be usually aluminum, versus your steel or your cast iron sliding calipers. So there's usually a weight benefit, but then also it depends on how everything else is kind of set up, like how if you have floating rotors and that kind of thing. But I think it can be, at least you can usually make them a lot stiffer, so you can have like a lot better pedal feel, and maybe a little more consistent braking with the monoblock versus the whole sliding assembly. I know with my Miata, when you're bleeding the brakes, you can watch the whole assembly kind of flexing when the person's kind of pumping it up and everything.
Mm-hmm.
So
yeah,
there's definitely benefits going to those more expensive monoblock calipers, but ultimately, if the piston area is sized the same between the two, they basically can do the same braking force.
Yes. The force that they can generate is the same, or would be the same. As you noted, compliance is huge in sliding calipers. That's why you'll never see them on a race car. But they're cheap, so they're good enough for your normal daily driver cars. And those sliding pins, just generally because the whole caliper is moving, you're going to have more friction in that assembly than, your fixed caliper. So that's the other downside why they don't belong in race cars, but they're good enough for you, maybe. So.
Yeah, I guess one small advantage that a sliding caliper can have is potentially they can heat up the fluid a little less, because you only have kind of the piston on one side. But that's usually, that's just maybe a consideration for if you're going to those larger brake calipers. Just worry about making sure you have a high boiling point fluid, as well as good brake cooling. So I guess from here we can talk a little bit about the fluid.
Yeah, I guess so. But a thing of note is On the nice fixed calipers, you'll see like fluid channels on the exterior of the caliper, and
Mm.
that is meant to keep the fluid cold and everything. So um, if you're buying the cheapest fixed caliper you can, it's a good point about fluid temp. But the fancy ones, the caliper designers did think of that, right? Some of that surface on like the really crazy ones, like the radicals, is meant for controlling temperature.
Hmm.
But yeah, as you mentioned, fluid is huge. You know, you need an incompressible fluid, just brake fluid. Um, so that's because you're just trying to generate a pressure in your system. So brake fluid, don't get it on your skin. It's bad for you. But also it is hygroscopic, so it attracts water. Um, so one upgrade, quote unquote, that you can do, for most people anyway, is bleeding your brakes if you haven't done it in a while. The brake fluid naturally attracts that water, which will build some compressibility into your fluid, and the temperature range that it cannot boil at, or it's hard to say cannot, but the temperature that it boils at is greatly reduced if it has water in the system. So it's another bad thing. So, every year, or, if you're not tracking your car or whatever, 2 years with .3 fluid's probably fine. But, um, you know, fluid's a big one. So, and it's relatively inexpensive. So,
Hmm. Hmm. Yeah. Yeah. So, I mean, but that kind of covers most of the full kind of brake system. I guess.
let's talk about pads
I
and
guess the last
rotors.
thing. Yeah, we didn't really go too much into pads and rotors. So, but yeah. So I guess that's a good place to move into as well. So obviously you got your caliper. It's clamping. Using it's between the pad or between the caliper and the rotor is the pad that's clamping onto, and yeah, so pads can come in a lot of different kind of compositions, compounds, types of materials. Ranging from your kind of organic, compounded street brakes that are have good friction at really cold temperatures, which is what you want when you're just leaving your driveway and everything, and but potentially don't have very good high temperature stability, and they basically, if you take them on a racetrack, they might just melt,
Hmm.
which definitely wouldn't be good. All the way up to your, you can go all the way up to your carbon brakes that Formula One cars have, that super light, lasts forever, but of course cost like millions, maybe not millions, but thousands of dollars basically. So that's kind of probably out of most people's reach.
Yeah. Well, and like an interesting note though about the carbon, is for a lot of road cars, not the fancy Formula One ones, right? But for a lot of road cars, your carbons will wear at temperature. Um, it's
Hmm.
it's interesting because if you work for a magazine and you're reviewing the car, you'll never notice it. Um, but a lot of these systems do wear. That's why you can buy steel rotor brake kits for your like 911 GT3, you know, um, and for your Corvette ZR1. Uh, and we can go into wear in a minute, but yeah, it's worth noting when your rotors cost 10 grand and they start wearing, yeah, they'll last forever on the street. But if you're really abusing your car, consider that it might turn into hundreds of dollars per lap for brake system.
Yeah, yeah. I guess a quick kind of side note. Yeah, some of those cars that come with the carbon ceramic brake packages and stuff. A lot of times, I think I would try to avoid that because of that really huge cost there. Like
Yeah.
That'd be crazy just having to get your brakes, your rotors replaced and spending thousands. I don't know if I would want to really deal with that for the maybe not huge performance advantage, especially if you're just doing track days. Like you don't need to win a race, so
Right.
you know you can definitely afford to. You maybe you can't afford to not, I guess, go with the steel brakes.
Yeah. Yeah, exactly. And it's not really a braking performance advantage. It's just, your giant steel rotors go to carbon and it's significantly lighter. So it's wonderful for your unsprung mass. But brake wise, you don't really get any outside of the lighter unsprung mass. You don't really get any benefit out of it. So,
Yeah. So, but yeah, so I guess going back to pads, you're kind of mid range. You're gonna find your like kind of semi metallic or ceramic type pads, and that's where you're gonna find your. But those can range though from your kind of autocross and street usage up to your endurance racing or sprint racing type pads. So even within those same kind of material choices, they're going to be catered towards. Some pads can be catered towards the really high braking force at low temperatures, and then others will be your more endurance race pads meant for low wear at really high temperatures, but maybe don't have much braking until you warm them up. Which in a race, sprint race or endurance race, you're gonna have no problem because you have the pace lap, 1 or 2 pace laps to get everything up to temperature. So it's not too much of a concern there.
right.
But if you're using those pads on your daily driver, street car, maybe that you take to track days every once in a while, you might maybe have a slight rude awakening when you come up to that first stoplight and everything's still freezing cold. So
Right.
and even if they do work okay, you also have the added, a lot of times, the added annoyance of just them being super loud and squeaky because and squealing, because usually pads like that, they're basically the race pads, they're going to be almost kind of stiffer, so they're gonna vibrate on the rotor at those low temperatures, creating that noise. So and then also usually those type of brake pads, they're not going to spend much time trying to optimize the noise of it because it's a racetrack,
And
race car. It's
certainly not when they're cold. They don't care about it.
Yeah, exactly. So yeah, I mean, it's one area, I think, probably one of the most important areas to look at for improving your brake performance. And I think a little later we'll get into like kind of maybe your upgrade path almost of what to look into if you're trying to get better brake performance, better longevity, that kind of thing. But before we go there, I guess the last thing would be your rotor. So your rotor, it's attached to your wheel hub, and it's just there to be the thing that the whole brake system clamps on to slow down your vehicle. But I guess its main function other than that is to also be a big kind of thermal mass to take a lot of that heat and dissipate it. So most of the time, most cars have at a minimum vented front rotors. Some you'll see with vented rears, maybe your more high performance cars.
Right.
But when we say vented, we mean basically in the center of it will be kind of hollowed out in order to give it a lot more surface area. Both on the outside of the rotor, you have some surface area that you can use to cool, but then it gives that kind of internal surface area to also increase cooling. And then kind of your higher performance rotors will have directional vanes basically, and what those are acting like is almost kind of like a fan to pull air basically usually it's from the center of the hub or the back of the rotor there into the rotor, then out the edges. So those can also help, but of course then it makes your rotors directional, so you need to make sure you have the right side rotor on the correct side to have the correct kind of venting effect. But then other things you can see, sometimes you'll see slots in the rotors. A lot of times basically those are meant for kind of help cleaning off the pad as it kind of goes across the rotor surface, and it kind of helps kind of outgas a little bit.
Yep.
all that interaction that's getting really hot and everything. So it helps keep the pads potentially fresher, maybe a little longer. But in my experience, I haven't really messed with them too much, and I'm not sure if the way I see it, I'm not sure if they're worth the added cost for maybe the slight maybe break the rotor wear benefit or not rotor wear, but a pad wear benefit you might see. So that's that honestly for me, I'd need to see a little more kind of evidence on it before I'd go out and worry too much about slots.
Right.
But
What about holes?
and then you also have holes. So cross drilled rotors. A lot of times I think it's more of a looks thing. They do look cool. I mean, because I don't know, maybe some race cars back in the day had them, so a lot of people like to copy that kind of thing. Obviously, it can reduce your weight of the rotor as well as, again, increase that surface area a little bit more. But the problem I see happen most often is because you have those holes, you're adding kind of weak points in your rotor, and that's where the cracks are going to start propagating. So they can kind of be avoided if you get a really high quality drilled rotor where basically the holes are cast in and then they just do a little bit of finish machining. But if someone's just if they're taking a perfectly good cast iron rotor and then throwing it on like a drill press and just putting a bunch of holes in it, it's gonna be a recipe for disaster for your brake setup.
Yeah, if you're using cheap cross drilled rotors, it's not worth it, for sure. And another thing to keep in mind is it obviously makes the rotor lighter, but when you're doing your math a bit down the road, for your pad area, you lose some of that area, because the area is assumed to be what's in contact with the rotor, which is the whole pad most of the time. But if you have holes in the rotor, obviously it's not contacting there. So it, will actually reduce your pad area a little bit. So, but yeah, I think, cheap cross-drilled rotors are just gross. So,
Yeah. Yeah, I would, for the most part, try to avoid those because usually they cost more too. So it's kind of like, oh, it costs more and it breaks sooner. Great, that's what I need.
No thanks.
Yeah. So,
but I guess that covers most of the system. Before we get too deep into upgrades and sizing, I think it's important to understand how the vehicle's reacting, and just on a big picture, like very broad stroke, your tires are still the limiting factor of slowing the car down. If you lock them up, you'll flat spot them, but you go from that static to kinetic area of friction. So great, maybe you can now lock your tires up easier because you've got all the pedal pressure, but it's not doing you anything. And then it's also good to realize that will change with conditions, right? So if you go out on a beautiful day, you step hard on the brakes and you decelerate at a certain rate. If it's raining, again, the tire's the limiting factor. So because you can only decelerate so much, right? Your upper limit is a lot lower. Then you're going to load the front less. So the car's weight transfer is going to be less. It's going to be closer to balanced, which would then indicate that you could use more rear brake, right? So this is where adjustable proportioning valves come in, right? So you can change that bias on the go. A little bit anyway. So
yeah,
just a big picture.
I always find that interesting because it's something you don't really think about when you're maybe out driving and it starts raining. But yeah, I remember I did the math when I was working on sizing the brake system for the Starion. Yeah, maybe if that ever comes together
One day.
But basically, I'm planning to go with one of those kind of 7-position brake proportioning valves that they sell versus the knob type.
Mm-hmm.
And I did the numbers, and yeah, based on kind of what you'd expect the friction, the kind of the tire friction to reduce to when it's wet, you're basically looking at like a full click adjustment when you're going from. Actually, no, you're looking at like 2 to 3 clicks from rain to dry. And sorry, the other interesting thing I found was with the Starion, with having 22 gallons of fuel on board, going from full fuel load to no fuel load, you actually would want to make 1 click adjustment from the beginning to the end of your stint to basically keep your brake bias matching properly with your weight transfer, because you'd be losing over 100 pounds of fuel through the stint basically. So
Yeah, that's a good point.
that's kind of some of your more advanced stuff, obviously, and kind of building that kind of adjustability in your system can definitely, of course, help. But I guess if we go back to the basics, looking at you're starting out, maybe you're building a champ car or Lemon's car or something like that, and you're looking at your stock brake setup, and you're like, what should I do here? How do I turn this from a grocery getter to a race car without breaking the bank?
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, I think the first place, yeah, we kind of touched on it. The first place you look at is probably going to be your brake pad, as well as, of course, the brake fluid. I think those are going to be your first spots to look at. So for brake pad, as we said, if you're doing some sort of endurance racing, you're definitely going to want like a full race pad. And that's, I guess, as far as like what's on the market, that's kind of so if you're looking at Hawks, that would be your DTC type pads. Carbotech, your XP, 8 through 12 or 14 or whatever number they go up to. Your G-Lock G series, so like up to your G18s or whatever. Art Robustus ST43, 45, kind of that range. Your PFC kind of 01, 08, those kind of those as well. I'm sure there's a lot of others. I'm sure Will would make something but basically you're looking at your full race compounds they're meant for long high brake temperature periods basically, and also they're going to provide you with good brake feel and modulation at those temperatures, versus something like you might be able to make like I know a popular one is a Hawk Blue. In some cars, I think you can get away with it, but from my experience, if you're doing kind of endurance racing, you're going to want to go to kind of basically a full race pad. Blue, I'd consider more an in between. It would be good in like an autocross track day kind of situation, but then also be okay on the street. So,
Great.
So yeah, it's definitely good to stay away from those autocross style pads when you're doing track racing. And then of course, if you're autocrossing, you want those pads to get up to temperature real fast, since you're basically going to brake within the first 100 feet or so. So they need to be ready right away. So it's definitely a consideration there.
Mm-hmm. Well, and
so I mean,
just as a upgrade, not just from a longevity standpoint, like you're mentioning, but an actual braking, deceleration standpoint, the mu, or the coefficient of friction you get out of these race pads when they're in their operating temperature is significantly higher than what you would have in your car now, which, I'm sure you've all been into the ABS or locked them up. So, you can just think of how much more these will get you, which you'll need when you have stickier tires. Again, we go back to that whole, relationship there. But, yeah, if you're frustrated with your braking system and feel like it's not braking enough, look at pads, right? That's your entire friction compound. So that's a great place to start. And the jump might be more than you think it'll be.
Yeah, and you actually touched on it too, because sometimes if you feel like your car's not stopping fast enough and you already have these race pads in there, then maybe your tire is basically the next area you need to look at, because that's what ultimately is slowing down the car as far as the interaction between the road and the tire. Of course, the brakes are enabling that deceleration, but uh, we talked about it a little bit in our intro to tire in 200 treadwear tire episode, that some of the tires are just better for that longitudinal grip, that braking. So don't always blame it on the brake system. It could be the tire as well is struggling, but this is more a brake episode, so we'll keep it obviously on the pad side for now. So, but yeah, I mean, yeah, going to those race pads a lot of times, and some manufacturers will advertise it kind of what they expect the mu to be, the friction coefficient to be at the operating temperature. So that's one way to kind of gauge a pad, because if you do go too aggressively, it can make it almost like an on-off switch, especially with like a 200 treadwear tire. So you want to be careful there. Maybe some pads are more designed for slick, slick tire usage. So, definitely try not to go to the super duper most aggressive race pads possible if you're just doing kind of 200 treadwear type racing or tracking. So, but also, I mean, one thing I have noticed trying out different compounds is sometimes those full super aggressive race pads can actually offer a little more longevity because they have that more temperature resistance, but maybe they just don't feel as good as far as they're a little more on-off switch, and they're a little harder to modulate, especially with like kind of with a 200 treadwear setup. So but making sure you have the kind of right pad for the application is definitely obviously the first thing to do. And although it sounds, you go to the auto parts store and it's maybe like $40 for a set of rear pads or front pads or something that are, just Wagner's or, Ribestos, or like the basic part store stuff. You might think, oh, I'm going up to $150, $200 set of pads for one axle that sounds like it's just going to quadruple my cost. But you'll actually see that $40 pad probably won't last more than, if you're doing like 20-minute sessions in a track day, it should be okay. But if you're doing 2-hour stints, it might not even last that long.
Right.
Whereas the full race pad could go 24 hours or so, hard racing. And so your cost may actually be lower in that case by having the correct pad for the job.
Right. Yeah, absolutely. So, I mean, I think we made it clear. This pad is where you start, right? And as we already went over fluid, right? Typically the higher level fluid, because it's dot rated and numerically, so will be more hygroscopic. So it'll have a higher temperature resistance. Some of them, you'll see a bunch of like dot fours that are rated very differently, right? Your AutoZone brand dot 4 is not as good as your, PFC fluid, or what's the Motul, right? It's a popular one. SRF or ATE. So they all have different boiling points, and typically what happens is the higher that boiling point, again, it's a generalization, the more hygroscopic it is. So if you're using these fancy fluids, they may resist heat better, which if you're on that limit is good and you want that or need that. But you should know that you need to bleed your brakes at increased intervals because of that. If you're racing, really you should be doing it before every race, maybe even before every day, right? If it's a, 2 races back to back, Saturday, Sunday, just bleed the brakes when day one is done, right? So,
yeah, and like going. I think a lot of times it definitely can be overkill going to the most expensive fluid, like, which I believe is SRF, is kind of the highest end one, the Castrol SRF. There's good middle grounds, I think, like the lower end, the Motul RBF 600, as well as I think a favorite of mine is the ATE, I guess ATE Blue, I guess Type 500 or whatever it's
Hmm.
called now.
Yeah, it's not blue anymore.
Um,
But
yeah, it's not blue anymore. But yeah, that seems to be a good kind of cost to performance ratio area. I think one thing I'd look out or try to avoid is band-aiding a brake overheating issue with just higher end fluid. I think you'll be better off kind of fighting the problem at the source, and that is with brake cooling. So that kind of leads, I guess, a little bit into rotors for one, but also just brake ducting. So
yeah.
for your track day car, maybe brake ducting isn't too feasible because you don't want to be cutting into your bumper and everything. But maybe it's not required because you're just doing 20-minute sessions. But once you get into a full racing scenario, endurance racing, that kind of those kind of situations, you're definitely gonna want to add some brake ducting. So like 2-3 inch hose is usually going to be enough. And some cars I've seen, they like NASCAR, I think they have sometimes they'll have like 3 hoses, 3 4 inch hoses going. One's going to the caliper, two are going right in the middle of the rotor. They're just
Yeah, those real race cars
like
get pretty wild.
yeah, like breaking a big NASCAR Cup car on the road courses can definitely require quite a bit. So you can see some pretty crazy setups on those. And so yeah, and just adding a brake duct that goes from the front of your car and vents ideally to the center of your rotor, which is usually how the vented rotors are designed to pull air from. That should give you much better, hopefully it can give you better pad life, it can give you better rotor life, and then also it can hopefully at least prevent that boiling of the fluid that'll greatly reduce your braking performance.
Yeah, I
But
mean, so to note about temperature, it's a compounding problem, and it's kind of cool but crazy how it works, right? One thing starts to get hot just outside of its temperature range, right? So let's say your pads are starting to degrade. Not that bad though yet, right? They're just a little outside their range. So as the driver, you step on the pedal just a little bit harder to make up for that. Because what you're doing when you do that is, building more pressure in the system, right? So this is what you feel when the pedal starts to get long, when you start to get scared about your brakes going away on the track. So you're pushing the pedal more to get the same force, or to get the same clamp load, but you're not even the same clamp load to get the same torque at the wheel, right? So what you're doing is you're squeezing the pads harder, so they're getting hotter sooner. So you have more force, more temperature. You're adding temperature to fixed temperature, right?
hmm
If you get into this area, it's not a problem that'll fix itself. So,
yes.
so yeah, cooling is very important. And yeah, I guess it's just something to keep in the back of your mind. The pads you're selecting do have an operating range. So theoretically, although it'd be hard pressed to happen, you could overcool your brakes, right?
hmm
So you're not in that operating range. So, that being said,
Yeah.
if you have a normal car and you're taking it to the track, they probably need to be cooled. So,
Yeah. Yeah. So it's one area I think I definitely I think a lot of teams could benefit a lot from it. There's not too many people, or a lot of people starting out won't really consider it as much, or if they do, they'll maybe they come up with something that's either not robust. I see a lot of brake ducts kind of dragging on the ground halfway through the race, um, or they're just they're not maybe venting it correctly. Because I've seen there's a possibility for causing some actually extra cracking by just shooting the air right on the rotor face, maybe on one side, and it's creating kind of that difference in temperature from one to the other, and it can either basically it just can create some kind of heat stress fracture. So that's one thing to be careful about. Is there's definitely a wrong way to vent to cool your brakes. So yeah, ideally you're venting it into the center of a vented rotor,
Mm-hmm.
um, and then that'll pull the air through from the middle out and cool both sides evenly. So, but I mean that kind of gets a little bit into the rotor as well. So the rotor is one area where I feel like you can very quickly overspend for really maybe no performance benefit. I I always felt my opinion has always been kind of the best bang for your buck is to go go all in on your pads, get some really good pads, good fluid. It doesn't have to be the top end, and then rotor you can just go get the cheapest white box and just but have a lot on hand for and just kind of keep an eye on them. Look for when the cracking becomes too much. Usually, my experience, they'll usually kind of wear out through cracking than they will before you lose too much kind of rotor material, before you wear down the material or the rotor itself. But that also can depend on the pad. Some pads are much more aggressive on the rotor
Mm-hmm.
than others, and usually those are going to be your longer lasting pads. Maybe the pads last a long time, but the rotors don't. But honestly, from a cost standpoint, I find you can go on Rock Auto or your local auto parts store and you can get them for most kind of like your Miata, your E30, BMW or something like that. You can get rotors for like $12, $15
Yeah.
versus your pads are $200. So, if you're wearing, if you get a higher wearing or a pad that wears the rotor more but lasts longer, then usually from a cost standpoint, it can be better as long as, of course, you're not destroying the rotor before 12 hours, 8 hours into the race or whatever, and
Mm-hmm.
you have to replace it. But I don't know. I find that you really don't have to go crazy on the rotor. I mean, you can start looking at a directional vane. That'll be definitely a good improvement in cooling. But of course, an increase in cost because now they have to stock two different part numbers for left and right. And then usually your rear rotors are going to be a different size too. So now you have specific part numbers for all four corners. And then on top of that, you got to be careful to make sure you put the right ones on. But yeah, I mean, from there you can go into your two-piece rotors, which are going to be usually lighter because now you have an aluminum center hat versus just all cast iron. And then you have your outer ring that you can potentially change out and keep the aluminum hat in place, so you only have to change the ring. But over time, you probably want to look at that aluminum piece because it could fatigue. But yeah, with your two piece, you have the opportunity to maybe also add some basically some floating pins. It basically allows the rotor ring to kind of slide a little bit on the hat, which can potentially reduce a little bit of that kind of brake drag you get on down the straights, just of the pad slightly sliding against the rotor. It helps kind of align it a little better. But that's starting to get a lot more expensive. I've seen rotors like that can start going for 200, 300 a piece, and you're probably still wearing them out nearly as often as just a white box cheap rotor. With maybe you get a marginal benefit from the longevity of the rotor, and it can be lighter, so that could be a performance benefit. But if we're just purely looking at kind of cost of performance, a lot of times it can be diminishing returns, I feel.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I guess on the note of rotors, just like there's two different types of calipers, you have floating and fixed caliper. You have the same with rotors, right? And you kind of touched on that with the two-piece, though not all two pieces are floating. The point here is when you fix your caliper, you need to have some slack, I guess, in the system directionally, because these rotors get hot, they expand. It's all a thermal problem. So the sliding caliper takes up for that with your normal solid rotor. But if you have a fixed caliper, you need to do that with a floating rotor. So, like you said, and that really helps the rotor grow in the direction of its width. It's not going to shake back and forth around the center of that ring. So that's why you have the two different types of rotors.
Yeah, but like I said, I feel like if you're just looking for good cost of performance, kind of going big with your pads and going cheap with your rotor seems to be kind of a winning formula, at least what I noticed in racing in like Champ Car. Of course, once you get into super high end, stuff where maybe you have a lot of horsepower, it's easy to stop a 100 horsepower Miata, that weighs 2,000 pounds. Once you have something that maybe weighs a little bit more, or to a lot more, that has 600 horsepower, that's when you're going to want to definitely start looking in your big brake kits,
Hmm.
your floating rotors, your larger, super thick vented rotors, that kind of stuff.
Yeah, the thing about adding speed, right? So if you've boosted your car or engine swapped it or whatever, energy, which is effectively all you're trying to bleed off with the brake system, is 1/2 mv squared, so velocity. So that v squared portion, well, it's squared, so it gets big quickly. So you know, that's really where you want to consider these sort of kits. But yeah, I guess so. Looking at these components, you can trade them out or upgrade based on your needs. So big picture, we said pads and fluid. If you feel like you're getting good stopping performance out of your brake system, at least initially, and then it starts to trail off, it kind of points you towards cooling being your problem. If you feel that you just can't brake, then we need to do something else about that. It starts with the pad, getting that higher coefficient of friction. But if you've already got some super pads, you need to brake more. How do we get more braking torque? And then that's going to be where these other kits come in. You're generating a torque about the wheel when you brake. And the force starts at the center of the pad. And then the lever arm is from that point to the center of the hub. So you can get more braking torque by moving that point out. So you could keep the same pad area and the same piston area. And if you moved your caliper out and obviously had the rotor to match it, you can get more braking torque. Most big brake kits don't just move your caliper, but that is an opportunity, right?
Mm-hmm.
And then when we start to look at these kits, that's when you see bigger brakes, sometimes more pistons with the same piston area. I've seen that on a few Miata kits. And what I think, personally, I think for these kits, what you're getting is lighter weight. They have the two-piece rotor, so they have an aluminum center, and then they have aluminum caliper. So even though you're going up in size, you might be able to lose some weight. So that's where I see the benefit for some of these. But otherwise, you get that larger moment arm, so you're getting more braking there. And then if you adjust your master cylinder with your new calipers based off of piston area, you can get more force on those pads as well. So
Yeah. I guess another thing, by increasing that rotor size, which, like you said, increases the torque, kind of the moment arm. But you're also potentially adding some more thermal mass by going to that bigger rotor, which can be a big benefit to cooling, especially, if you're doubling your horsepower, that's something that's going to start becoming quickly a problem. So yeah, by going to that bigger rotor, you're adding some more cooling capacity, more kind of heat load or heat capacity of the system, and while also potentially increasing your brake torque a little bit. And then you touched on a little bit, talking about multiple pistons, going from two piston or single piston sliding to two piston to four piston to six piston. I mean, I'm sure there's like 8 piston stuff out there. I think I've seen it on like crazy Mercedes SLS, shit like that. But yeah, I mean, as far as pistons, because I think that's one area that maybe people just think, oh, well, six piston, that's more race car equals more better.
Right.
More pistons definitely equals more better. But the main, from what I've seen, the main benefit from going to more pistons is basically it allows you to have a larger size pad, which again, that can help with your thermal properties. It can help with the longevity of the pad. I mean, by increasing that pad area, of course, that's increasing your braking force. Although usually, sorry, actually, I mean, the braking force is basically calculated based on your piston size. So if you're increasing your piston size, or if your piston size stays the same, and you're just increasing your pad size, that actually isn't changing your brake torque. But it creates a larger area for kind of the pad to get up to temperature, as well as the rotor to also get hotter. So that it can increase, basically it can help with, again, further help with temperature issues, and more pad material is usually going to mean longer pad life, especially if you start, like, one advantage I see going to these big brake kits, at least that I would want to take advantage of, especially in an endurance racing situation, is a lot of times it opens up thicker pad options, which will definitely give you much more wear life. And a lot of times for the money it can be better. A lot of times the pads won't be that much more expensive, or the same for the thicker material ones, and you'll just be able to get that much more life out of them. So but yeah, it's one thing to look, or one thing to be careful with. Just because you're going to some crazy six piston thing and the pads look twice as big, it doesn't really mean you're actually getting more braking force. That's basically just determined by that piston size. It just means, you'll get a little more from the larger, brake moment from the larger rotor, but ultimately it's just that piston size. So a lot of these big brake kits, like, they're usually, in order to keep it compatible with the stock brake system, they just add more pistons but smaller area, which ultimately doesn't really give you any more brake force. It's just giving you more heat capacity for maybe longer track days, stuff like that. But a lot of times I feel like it's weird seeing these big brake kits on a track day car that only needs to really go 20-minute sessions, and then you have guys running 24-hour races in Champ Car and Lemons and stuff like that, and they're and they're running stock calipers with stock looking rotors and just a race pad in there. So it's it's kind of funny to see. But
yeah, I mean, if you're wearing the caliper like jewelry, go for it. Just trying to make it look cool and show off. Why not? But it may not, necessarily be the answer.
Yeah, and then I guess one other feature I've seen in kind of the higher end calipers that I would tend to look out for is having different. Basically, they'll have different piston sizes as you starting from the leading edge of the pad to the trailing edge. So the first piston will be the largest, basically to get that initial clamp, and then it'll taper off as the pad's basically kind of heating up as it's sliding across the rotor. By tapering it down, you're trying to even out the pad wear, because it'll be kind of, as you get towards the edge of the pad, it'll get much hotter and it might taper off and wear more. So one thing I've seen with kind of your high end like AP racing calipers is that they'll have that different size piston to help wear. Because one thing I've noticed a lot with some of those kind of Willwood brake kits is that you will get some kind of tapered pad wear, which it's just, you're not using all of the pad for as effectively as you could be. It shouldn't really show up in braking feel or performance, assuming the pistons are all sized, the total area is the same, but it can help with the pad wear, basically.
Right.
But unfortunately that's usually only on your much higher end calipers. Which is a shame, because I mean, I don't think it's that much more cost to put a different size hole in the caliper. Of course, they have to stock different size pistons, but a lot of times they already do, because they're going to offer a caliper in 4 different piston sizes or something like that.
Right.
So it's one thing with specifically Willwood, which is kind of usually your cheapest kind of entry level fixed caliper you're going to find. Some of them do have the different size pistons, so that's maybe one thing to look out for if you are going that direction, kind of going for monoblocks, fixed calipers. But
And so I guess while we're talking about cheap versus expensive calipers, another thing you might be able to get, or you should be able to get out of a big brake kit, um, out of a good one, would be reducing compliance in your brake system. And this all goes back to driver feel, which under brakes is huge, right? Very important to lap time. So, we've already discussed how there's more compliance in sliding calipers, but you should also pay attention to how you mount your caliper and how much compliance is within that caliper. Willwood, for instance, has a wide range of calipers. They make, some heavy duty ones, some light ones, and you can see the difference in compliance between the two is noticeable, right? The light ones will be cheaper, as the name implies. They'll be lighter, so there's some benefits there, but they will flex, more. So that's worth noting. So if you're trying to get rid of compliance, you don't really want to add it back in. And another place you might add it back in if you're not paying attention is the brake mounting bracket. Really just use a stiff bracket. If you're designing one, design it for stiffness, right? That's what you're trying to get. I've seen lots of flimsy, but cool looking anodized brackets. And yeah, I mean, they, at least from what I've seen, they don't break, which is a big benefit. They shouldn't. And they get your caliper to sit on your wheel now, but you don't want to put all this compliance back in. So that's, I guess that's worth noting between cheap and expensive. And race cars will have radially mounted calipers, but most likely you're not, even with a big brake kit. So, but radially is stiff.
The radial mounting. I think Wilwood does offer some radial mounted stuff, and I think that is definitely a one way to go to try to increase your stiffness of that whole assembly. But I guess, and you were talking about this will manifest itself in driver feel. And I guess another way reducing the compliance can manifest itself is in kind of what they call pad knockback. So basically, what you'll find is, say you go through some tight corners, and kind of the flex of your brake mounting, as well as mainly your hub assembly and everything, that whole assembly will flex and push the pad kind of back into the caliper, and basically when you go on the brakes, after you go through these tight corners, come on the straight, hit on the brakes, now all of a sudden you have to wait for the pad to kind of move back. So potentially increasing kind of some of that stiffness can help in that scenario. But also, I guess another feature to look out for is some of these brake setups will have a little, what they call anti-knockback spring. And that will just help push, it's just a light, like 8-pound spring or something that helps push the piston back out after you get onto the straight there. But yeah, that could end up adding a tiny bit more drag going down the straight. If you don't want to spend the money and going adding springs and going crazy like that, the easy solution is to basically on the driver's side, as you're going down the straight, you just hold your right foot on the brake or right foot on the gas and just tap the brake to make sure you kind of center up those pads again. So
right, and some of the pro approach, if you have these anti-knockback springs and you want to get rid of this drag, lots of teams just leave them in there because that's what they're there for. But if you have 6 pistons or up, you remove the middle spring. So you still have the spring on your leading and trailing edge controlling your pad, but now you don't have as much, just nominal spring force pushing your pad into the rotor. So take out that middle one.
Yeah. Yeah. So it's one other area to look out for. But then of course, just adding stiffness to that whole assembly will just make the brake pedal feel kind of stiffer. You'll get more meaningful kind of brake force from the same amount of travel, or from the same amount of travel. So
Hmm.
it's definitely having kind of a solid pedal can definitely it'll feel better. It'll be easier for you to modulate the brakes and everything. So definitely a benefit there. I mean, it shouldn't be ignored.
Right.
But
And another area of compliance, well, a big area that you always hear about for compliance, but I'm not sure I'm sold, is in those flexible lines that go from your hard line out to the wheel end. The idea is, if you look at the hoses on your car, it's rubber. You go buy some braided stainless steel hoses, which aren't going to flex as much, when you build up all that pressure. So now you have a flexible hose, but it's just a little stiffer. So it helps avoid that compliance. At least that's how it's sold. Now, I have seen from a car where the caliper was rebuilt incorrectly, so the caliper locked, cooked the whole corner. When it came back in, I was looking at the brake line because it was a soft line, and the rubber flaked off, and below all the rubber was stainless steel braided line. So, um, yeah, I'm not sure that's not what it comes with from the factory, right? Maybe that just happened to be
yeah,
this car. It was a normal sedan, so there's no reason I would expect it to stand out. So maybe it's not a universal thing and I'm slightly crazy, but I have seen braided line under the rubber. So then there'd be no
yeah,
benefit from.
I think that is my understanding. I mean, although it has an outer kind of rubber coating or layer, inside there is some reinforcement, some kind of metal reinforcement. I mean, I'd be really surprised if, I mean, because what we're talking about, if it was just a straight solid rubber line, I mean, it's the same that you'd use for your like coolant hoses and stuff that can barely handle
Yeah,
20 psi,
yeah,
let alone
a few
a couple
thousand.
thousand. I mean, it's still hydraulic hose, although yeah, maybe it has some rubber layers. It's still rated for the pressure that it's meant for.
Hmm.
Um, Honestly, the main benefit I see with those braided stainless lines is just maybe a little more strength from kind of picking up debris or abrasion or something, um, in a racing situation where you might find yourself flying through the grass and stuff when you're going off the track. It can help with the kind of strength of the hose, because as you said, I mean, you had an issue there, and part of it, part of the outer layer came off. That's something you then want to replace. Whereas if the hose is designed to have that hard braiding layer on the outside, then it should be a little stronger overall.
Hmm.
But yeah, I'm not super convinced you're going to see a huge brake feel. A lot of that can be kind of placebo effect. You,
I
you
think
add it to the
so.
car, and you expect there to be a change, so you kind of are looking for it, and you might just any slight difference, you're like, oh yeah, that must be the brake lines. But maybe because you installed those lines, you bled your brake fluid, and,
Right.
and now they're nice and stiff again. So you're like, oh man, these lines are awesome. But in reality, it was actually just the fact that you bled your brakes for the first time, like since you own the car. So,
Yeah. Yeah. So I mean,
so
they
yeah,
look cool, but
yeah, yeah. The benefit is to be seen. Yeah, I mean, I know my Spec Miata came with them, and it's just, I don't know. I haven't had any problems with them, but I mean, even those can wear out too. You can. It's just one thing I think to look out for, to potentially replace your brake lines a little more often than you think. Don't just set it and forget it. Check them, make
hmm.
sure they're okay, because obviously if that goes wrong, you're gonna have a bad day.
Right. Yeah, absolutely.
But yeah, I think that really covers most of the areas. I'm just trying to think. I mean, one thing we didn't really get into is like ABS systems and stuff, but obviously that's a whole nother can of worms there.
Yeah.
And most of the time, at least, I mean, my Spec Miata doesn't have ABS. I think a lot of these older cars that you're going to see in endurance racing kind of won't have it, or a lot of people disable it. But ABS is a whole nother kind of animal that, and yeah, it's something we
Yeah.
could maybe go into in the future. But I think Here, maybe not necessary right now, but yeah, I mean, I think is there anything else you can think of?
Um, yeah, I think it's just more fun details rather than things for the average person to consider. You know, but for race cars, which you'll see a lot of the time, is they have two master cylinders instead of one, so they don't have a prop valve that's limiting the fluid going to the rear. Instead, they're just pushing on those two master cylinders, and they have a bar going in between them, and the pedal pushes on the bar, and then they have a proportioning knob that moves that bar closer to one pedal or another, and then that's how they change their bias. So it's cool. You probably don't have to worry about it, but they're mechanically changing their bias rather than just through limiting fluid pressure somewhere.
Yeah, it's pretty sweet because then they'll usually have a knob that screws has a cable that screws into that bias bar, and we'll be able to adjust it on the fly basically. Usually, from what I've seen, they don't do too many adjustments on the fly. I'm not sure. I guess I know in Formula One those guys are adjusting brake bias for every corner, but yeah, I mean it can help you set it up. You're definitely going to want to adjust it when you're starting a rain race versus a dry one. But yeah,
And like you
it's a
mentioned,
pretty cool setup.
changing fuel load. I've seen that. So yeah,
Yeah, yeah. There's a lot of cool stuff that race cars are doing that I wish we could all have on our like street cars and stuff like that, but
yeah.
or track day cars. But yeah,
But I guess
I think
so. To just summarize, I guess the hierarchy goes: if you're going to the track, get pads, get good pads for whatever you're doing, whether it's autocross or track use, or if it's your first endurance race, get some more endurance focused pads, but get pads, bleed your fluid. Then if you start to notice have that longer pedal or something, work on your cooling. Maybe even be a little proactive and work on your cooling first. Um, you know, Brian mentioned it, but I don't think he really emphasized how important it is to direct that cooling. Because, like he mentioned, it might cause problems, but I've seen lots of people point a vent in the general direction of the rotor, and it doesn't work that great. Don't be shy about putting it in the center of those vents. So yeah, get, excuse me, work on your cooling. If you're having thermal problems, if you're having, brake problems, you just can't generate enough force, and you've already explored what you would want to do with a master cylinder, then go ahead and move that caliper out. And most of the time, if you're just buying parts, while you do that, the remainder of a big brake package is going to be included. And yeah, just remember everything we talked about. For that package, weight, compliance, stiffness, cooling. So yeah, and another thing that's related only because it's mounting your caliper, but it's not quite related to your brake system performance, is how your new bracket centers your caliper. From the factory, those calipers should be centered on the rotor, which is then going to be centered typically around your wheel bearing. And that's the rotor surfaces, not where it mounts, but where you're clamping. If it's off of that, you're going to generate, a moment around your wheel bearing, so it'll wear a little quicker. So if you're looking at a kit and it moves your caliper drastically, maybe, consider that. You don't want to be replacing wheel bearings all the time or something. But yeah, I mean, I think that's most of it. Am I forgetting anything?
yeah, I guess one last tip I just thought of was Well, one, make sure you follow the recommended kind of bed-in procedure when you get a new set of pads in there.
Mm-hmm.
Um, I know some of the manufacturers like Carbotech and G-Lock, they have a very specific bedding procedure that they want you to do. Because one thing I've seen a lot of teams complain about in Champ Car specifically is, and we've had the same issue with one of our cars, where you get a lot of brake shaking. And first thing you think, oh, my rotor's warped, but a lot of times the rotor really doesn't warp in that sort of fashion. It's pretty difficult to kind of see that much movement, that much kind of thermal distortion to really feel that.
Mm-hmm.
What usually is happening is it's an uneven pad, basically pad the wear transfer. Basically, pad transfer is uneven, and it'll create kind of a dead spot in the rotor, which will come up with with that shaking. So a lot of times, some of that will be as if when you come into the pits and you're kind of hard on the brakes and it's just sitting there really hot, it can melt a little bit of the pad of the rotor and create that shaking. Other ways I've seen is just if you didn't bed it in correctly, it can create those kind of dead spots in the rotor. So one thing to look out for is make sure you follow those procedures to make sure everything's going to be working as best as it could. So.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, I mean, other than that, that's kind of going through the big things, the basics. Like I said, maybe in the future we could talk about ABS systems a little bit, maybe more motorsport, the more crazy things that they do to have all the extra adjustability, performance, lightweight, that kind of stuff.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, I think that covers brakes pretty good as far as like an intro. But yeah, another more tech focused one. I think as being in the off season here, we're mostly focusing on that, and then of course we like to cover some of the pro races as well as some of the club stuff too. So we'll keep an eye on some more coverage there, and we'll keep these tech ones coming out in this kind of off season. But yeah, thanks again for kind of listening this long. If as we always say, if you want to reach out to us, we have our social medias, our Facebook, our Instagram,
Mm-hmm.
those pages at Motorsports Tech Talk. It should be pretty easy to find them. If you want to find these episodes easier without even, I mean, although it's good to follow those, it's when we post up when they're going to be released and everything. But if you just subscribe to the podcast or follow it, or on Spotify or iTunes, it's going to automatically come up now, when the new episodes come up. So a lot of times, sometimes you'll see they'll pop up even before we announce them on Facebook. So you can get a little early access there, I guess. But yeah, so if you have any questions or maybe any topics you want us to cover, just reach out to us on our social medias, and we thanks again. We thank you again for listening this long, and we hope to talk to you guys again soon.
See ya.